So today's episode comes to you courtesy of Jared, who's been supporting this channel as a Golden Pig tier patron. I truly couldn't do this without the support from amazing patrons like Jared, so again, Jared, thank you so much. And for the personalized deck tech, Jared chose an underrated commander. And the underrated commander that Jared chose for this deck is Umori the Collector, focusing on Artifact Storm. Umori is a 4/5 ooze for 2 Golgari that can be a companion, but not for this deck, obviously. As it enters the battlefield, choose a card type, and spells you cast the chosen type cost 1 less to cast. So this commander can be incredibly powerful in an artifact build. Cost reduction can save you a lot of mana throughout the game, and in many instances, especially with artifacts, well, it can make spells much cheaper to cast. In fact, with these artifacts, it can make a lot of them free to cast. So we can cast artifact after artifact after artifact and storm off for a victory. And of course, in these colors, we've got plenty of fantastic ways to recur cards as well, so there are plenty of explosive plays that we can have. Now, on this episode, as well as, basically all my other deck techs as well, every single card in the deck, including the commander this time, is going to be less than $1, so it's a very budget-friendly build. And actually, because of that restriction, this is Artifact Storm, but with a slight twist. The artifacts that we are going to be storming off with are also creatures, so when Umori does come into play, we are actually going to be choosing creature. It's going to have the exact same effect for our storm pieces, again, those cards that are going to cost 1 less, essentially now costing 0, but of course it also reduced the cost of any other creatures in our deck as well, versus the, one other artifact that is not a creature that we have. So just a slight clarification there, and as for another clarification, well, when I'm going through the cards on this episode, I'm going to be breaking things down into different tactics to show you how this deck works and how we're going to win with it. And of course, if you are interested in this deck, well, make sure you check out that link in the description below. And now with all that said, let's jump into it. First up, when it comes to ramping, well, we can really utilize creatures that actually help ramp us when they hit the graveyard. And so let's talk about cards like Veteran Explorer, Primal Druid, and Viridian Emissary. Veteran Explorer says when it dies, each player may search the library for the 2 basic land cards, put them on the battlefield, then each player searches their library this way, shuffles it. With this deck, we're going to be getting creatures out and getting them to our graveyard quite quickly. So yeah, although this does, boost our opponents as well and ramp them, it can get us to our explosive turns quicker and can make those turns even more explosive. Because keep in mind, those lands do come into play untapped. On the other hand, we've got Primal Druid and Viridian Emissary, both of which do the exact same thing. When they die, we can search our library for a basic land, put on the battlefield, tap, then shuffle. So these don't benefit our opponents, but that land does come into play tapped. But still, again, keep in mind, with Umori, though these usually would cost us 2 mana to get out, again, they're only going to cost 1 when Umori is in play. Speaking of which, at 2 mana, which again with Umori is just 1, we've got Beastcaller Savant, which has haste. It can tap to add 1 mana of any color to our mana pool, but we can spend this mana only to cast a creature spell. So this kind of is like a free way to ramp with this deck. Again, we pay a single green mana to get this out, and then this can tap for mana right away for one of our other creatures. And yeah, we are running a ton of creatures in this deck. Moving on, of course, Steve can help us out as well. Sacrifice to go get a base land, put into play tapped. Again, normally Steve would cost 2, which is still fantastic, but again with Umori, just 1. Or how about Splingbrim Druid, which is basically like a Harrow on a body in a way. Sacrifice a land when it comes into play. If you do, search your library for the 2 basic lands with them on the battlefield tapped, then shuffle. And finally, we're also going to be running Tangled Florahedron, which is a simple mana dork that can tap for a green, but also, of course, it is an MDFC, so on the back, it is a land, so if we need to utilize it as a land, we can. If not, it can be a great way for us to ramp. But now it's time for us to move on to the real stars of the show. And that would be the absurd amount of free artifact creatures in this deck, because again, with Umori in play, when we say creature, well, these artifact creatures, which normally would cost us 1, cost 0, which of course can lead to some very absurd plays. First up, there's Mirror Moon Vessel, which has got to be the best of these. When it's put into a graveyard from play, you add a colorless. So again, we could essentially just cast this for free when Umori's in play, and of course we've got plenty of ways to sacrifice this for free, so yeah, we can essentially sacrifice it for value, and on top of that, generate a mana by doing so. Now, all of our 1 mana artifact creatures don't necessarily need to provide us any value, outside of just being a, free body to throw onto the battlefield, but it's nice when they do. I mean, how about Iron Apprentice? Enters the battlefield, they counter on it. When it dies, if it had counters on it, put those counters on target creature you control. In a somewhat similar way, there's Sparring Construct. When it dies, put a +1 counter on target creature you control. Again, just some nice additional benefits. Next up, there's Arcbound Worker, which has modular 1, so when it dies, you can put a +1 counter on target artifact creature you control. And then Mere Scrappling, which we can sacrifice, by itself to put a +1 counter on target creature. Next up, there's Drillworks Mole, which has pay 2 and tap, put a +1 counter on Drillworks Mole, and put a +1 counter up to 1 target commander you control. Now, will we ever activate that? Well, there might be a situation or two where that really comes up, but again, the important part about all these is that these are 1 mana creatures that essentially, again, are going to be free for us to cast. So we're also going to be running Chronomaton, which can get counters on itself, Inquisitive Puppet, which has when it enters the battlefield, scry 1. So that's some nice additional free card selection. On top of that, we can exile this Inquisitive Puppet to make a 1/1 white human creature token, but chances are we're probably not going to do that because, yeah, we want to just be able to keep utilizing this card. And then there's Signal Pest, which is a 0/1 for 0, again with our commander in play. It does have Battle Cry, so whenever it attacks, each other tag creature gets +1 +0 until end of turn. So if we feel like swinging out with our army, yeah, we can. And we'll talk about ways to build up quite the army with this deck. But not before we talk about even more free creatures with Mirror Mind Servant, Heap Doll, and Gingerbrute. Mirror Mind Servant has pay 2 and tap, shuffle your library. Heap Doll can be sacrificed to exile target card from a graveyard, and Gingerbrute does have haste and can be basically unblockable unless an opponent's creature has haste. And if we really need to, we can pay 2 to tap and sacrifice it to gain 3 life, because of course this is a food golem, which is definitely a thing. Speaking of haste, Jawbone Skulkin can give target red creature haste until end of turn, so while none of our creatures are red, we can utilize this politically if an opponent's creature is red if we really need to. And then Keeper of the Lens says you may look at face-down creatures you don't control, so yeah, if you're playing against your friend's Morph deck, that's a nice additional benefit. Or how about Brass Man, a 1/3 that does not untap during your untap phase, but you can pay 1 to untap during your upkeep, but yeah, I mean, it's just basically a 1/3 for 0 again for this deck's purposes. And when it comes to some other blockers, we've got Lightning Core Excavator, Locked-Away Gargoyle, and Roterothopter. Lightning Core Excavator can be sacrificed to deal 3 damage to any target. Locked-Away Gargoyle has pay 4, it gets +2 +0 and flying till end of turn, and Roterothopter is, well, a 0/2 with flying that we can pump. Most of the time, though, we're going to be utilizing our mana for other things. Speaking of which, there's Thraben Gargoyle, which is a simple 2/2 with Defender, but we can pay 6 to turn to a 4/2. We're probably not going to be doing that, but you never know, it might come up. And we're going to finish off our 1-drop artifact creatures with some defenders with Walking Bulwark, Steel Wall, and Excavated Wall. Walking Bulwark has pay 2. We can make, target creature with Defender, get haste, can attack as though not a Defender, and assign combat damage equal to its toughness rather than its power. But, yeah, usually we're not going to be utilizing our mana for that, but if we need to, we can. And then Steel Wall is a simple 0/4 defender, Excavated Wall is the exact same, but we can also utilize it to pay 1 to tap and mill a card. Now, you might think we're done with free creatures right now, but we're not quite done just yet. Because we're also going to be running Ornithopter, which is just inherently a free creature. Yeah, that cost reduction doesn't do anything for us with this, but still a 0/2 flyer for 0 can be fantastic in this deck. Speaking of which, there's Stonecoil Serpent, a 0/0 for X, but again, with our commander and that cost reduction, that 1 is essentially paid for us. So if we just, say X equals 1, we get a free spell. So then it's going to enter the battlefield with 1 counter on it, and it's got reach, trample, and protection from multicolored, which can come in handy in certain circumstances. Regardless, one of the spiciest creatures to reduce the cost of in this deck might be Hidden Herbalist, because it's a 2/2 for 1 and a green, but again with that cost reduction from our commander, just a single green. And it has Revolt. When it enters the battlefield, if a permanent you control left the battlefield this turn, add green to your mana pool. We are going to have a lot of permanents leaving the battlefield, so yeah, that Revolt is very easy for us to trigger, and yeah, basically, again, this only costs us 1 mana to get out. We're going to get 2 mana for getting this out, so this essentially just ramps us right then and there. Or I guess I shouldn't say ramp, but it technically gets us ahead on mana right then and there. You know what I mean? Kind of like a ritual effect. Anyways, now that we have talked about all these creatures that we're going to be getting out essentially for free, or, even gaining mana on, what are we going to be doing with them? And of course, we are going to be utilizing them to draw a ton of cards, with cards like Grim Haruspex, Midnight Reaper, and Liliana's Standard Bearer. Grim Haruspex says, whenever another non-token creature you control dies, draw a card. So once we're set up properly, and we'll get to some free sacrifice outlets here in a bit, we can just sacrifice creatures willy-nilly, draw a ton of cards, because again, those artifact creatures, again, we are basically casting for free, so we can just dump all of them onto the battlefield, sacrifice them, draw even more, probably draw into some more artifact creatures that we can cast for free, and you see where this is going. So of course, the more of these draw effects we have in play, the better. I mean, Midnight Reaper is another great one with a slight downside. Whenever a non-token creature you control dies, Midnight Reaper deals 1 damage to you, and you draw a card. 1 life for 1 card is going to be well worth it, and of course we also have some ways to, gain life too, but yeah. Liliana's Standard Bearer is another great way to draw cards a ton at once. It has flash, and it says, when it enters the battlefield, draw X cards for X the number of creatures that died under your control this turn. Keep in mind, this counts the total number of creatures in a turn that have died, and here's a little spoiler for things coming up. There's definitely going to be times where we have the same creature die multiple times in a single turn. So yeah, this can draw us an absurd amount of cards for just 3 mana. Next up, how about Smothering Abomination, which is incredible in this deck. It says at the beginning of your upkeep, sacrifice a creature, which of course is not a downside for this deck, but an upside. And whenever you sacrifice a creature, draw a card. So this one actually doesn't care what kind of a creature it is, and we're going to be talking about some tokens here in a bit. So yeah, counting token creatures as well can be massive. And speaking of counting other things, there's Harvester of Souls, which says whenever another non-token creature dies, you may draw a card. Keep in mind, this counts our opponent's creatures as well, so that can be huge. And speaking of huge, on the other end of things, we've got Soul the Harvest. Whenever another non-token creature enters the battlefield under your control, you may draw a card. So we essentially have both ends covered when they come into play, and when they leave play, we can draw a lot of cards. Next up, what I believe is actually the only other artifact in this deck, outside of all of our, 1-mana artifact creatures. How about Gate to the Afterlife? An incredible card in this deck. Whenever a non-token creature you control dies, you gain 1 life, then you may draw a card. If you do, discard a card. So while looting isn't straight-up card advantage, it is fantastic card selection, and also getting creatures into our graveyard can actually be a good thing, and we'll talk about why here in a bit. Moving on though, how about Fecundity, which says whenever a creature dies, that creature's controller may draw a card. Now this does benefit our opponents, but believe me, we're going to be taking more advantage of this than anyone. And again, like Smothering Abomination, this counts any kind of a creature, including creature tokens, and we're going to be making a lot of those. And finally, there's Moldavine Reclamation, which is kind of the best of both worlds. It only counts our creatures, and any kind of creatures we have. Whenever a creature control dies, you gain 1 life and draw a card. So yeah, tokens count too. So this can be massive for us throughout the game, padding our life total and drawing us an absurd amount of cards. But of course, like I mentioned earlier, we need some ways to actually ensure that our creatures do hit the graveyard. So of course, we're going to be running a ton of fantastic free sacrifice outlets like Viscera Seer and Woe Strider. Viscera Seer says sacrifice a creature, scry 1, and Woe Strider basically does the exact same thing, sacrifice another creature, scry 1, and on top of that, it comes into play with a cute little goat as well, that you can of course also sacrifice. Anyways, yeah, free sacrifice outlets like this one are incredible in a deck like this. Again, just keep in mind, we are going to be getting out those artifact creatures for free, sacrificing them right away with these, getting value from them, and of course, getting those triggers that we just talked about to draw into even more artifact creatures that we of course will be also casting for free and repeating this again and again and again for some very powerful plays and effects. Now, next up, when it comes to free sacrifice outlets, we're also going to be utilizing Viral's the Scar Striped, Nim Shambler, and Dimir Houseguard. Each of these do various things, but the most important thing that they all do is they have sacrifice a creature to regenerate themselves. So these are protected sacrifice outlets, ones that are harder to deal with and can survive, a vast amount of board wipes. Now on top of that, Viral's gives our creatures that aren't graveyard scavenge. We're probably not going to utilize that, but nice to just keep that in mind. Anyways, Nim Shambler is going to get +1/+0 for each artifact we control, which of course can be a ton at a certain point, but yeah, again, the main thing is sacrifice outlet. And then Dimir Houseguard actually can be transmuted for 1 black, which actually can come in really handy. Basically, go tutor for any card in our deck that has converted mana cost to 4, and yeah, there are some really heavy hitters in there to go get. Moving on though, when it comes to non-free sacrifice outlets, we've got some that can provide us an absurd amount of value like Evolutionary Leap and Mind Slash. Evolutionary Leap has pay a green and sacrifice a creature, reveal cards to the top of your library until you reveal a creature card with that card in your hand, the rest of the bottom of your library in a random order. Again, the vast amount of creatures in this deck, again, are those 1 mana creatures that we can cast for free, so yeah, we can just keep utilizing this to sacrifice creatures for value to get more creatures that we can utilize to sacrifice for value. Or how about Mind Slash, an incredibly brutal card in this deck. Pay a black, sacrifice a creature, target opponent reveals their hand, choose a card from it, that player discards that card. We can easily wipe our opponent's hands, or at the very least, just take out the best cards in their hand. So yeah, we can really hamstring our opponents with a card like this, again, while getting value out of sacrificing our creature. And speaking of value out of sacrificing creatures and hampering opponents, we can also utilize an incredible sacrifice out like Phyrexian Plague Lord, which has sacrifice a creature, target creature gets -1/-1 until end of turn. Again, with the amount of creatures that we can sacrifice in a single turn, which is an absurd amount, well, we can take out basically any creature we want to take out with this. So we can decimate our opponent's armies over time, and yeah, it's going to be really hard for them to keep anything of value in play. And when it comes to them not keeping anything of value, well, there's Thought Picker Witch, which is, well, another brutal card. Pay 1, sacrifice a creature, so not free, but not all that expensive. Look at the top 2 cards of target opponent's library, then remove one of them from the game. So we are essentially fate sealing our opponents with something like this. Again, we can sacrifice a lot of creatures. We've got a ton of fodder. We sacrifice those creatures, and we utilize that to ensure that our opponents aren't getting anything of value off the top of their library. So we can essentially ensure that they have a dead draw on every single turn, and yeah, at a certain point, yeah, we're just gonna win through attrition. Next up, we've also got some other creatures that can help us throw a wrench into our opponent's plans with things like Mass Vandal, Reclamation Sage, and Butcher of Malakir. Mass Vandal has, when enters the battlefield, you may exile a creature card from your graveyard. If you do, exile target artifact or enchantment an opponent controls. And then Reclamation Sage says, when enters the battlefield, you may destroy target artifact or enchantment. But the biggest of these effects when it comes to really throwing a wrench in our opponent's plans comes with Butcher of Malakir, which says when it or another creature you control dies, each opponent sacrifices a creature. This kind of Grave Pact effect is incredible in this kind of a deck. Again, we're going to be getting an absurd amount of creatures in play, and sacrificing them, it's going to be impossible essentially for our opponents to keep any creatures on the battlefield with this there. Which of course can also help lead us to us winning in many ways. Because we're also going to be making a massive number of creatures and building a giant army with cards like Golgari Germination, Blightmound, and Gutter Grime. Golgari Germination says whenever a non-token creature you control dies, create a 1/1 green sapperling creature token. Now keep in mind that yes, with this we can build up a massive army with all the creatures that we're sacrificing, but also, again, if we do have, those cards like Fecundity or Moldavine Reclamation in play, we can draw even more cards by essentially, again, sacrificing a creature, replacing it with a creature token, sacrificing that creature to draw further. But yeah, going wide is definitely a way for us to win as well, and yeah, Blightmound can help too. Attacking pests you control get +1 with 0 and have Menace. Whenever a non-token creature control dies, create a 1/1 black and green pest creature token with, when this creature dies, you gain 1 life. Or how about Gutter Grime, which can make some massive creature tokens. It says whenever a non-token creature you control dies, put a slime counter on Gutter Grime, then put an ooze creature token on the battlefield with this creature's power and toughness are each equal to the number of slime counters on Gutter Grime. It's not going to take us very long to start making some incredibly massive creatures with this. And keep in mind, those other creatures will be growing over time. And speaking of making a massive army, though, there's Ogre Slumlord, which says whenever a non-token creature dies, you may create a 1/1 black rat creature token, and rats you control have Death Touch. Keep in mind, this counts our opponent's creatures as well, so yeah, this can make us a ton of creature tokens throughout the game for a lot of value. Or we can make a lot of creature tokens at once with a Zoni Thousand-Eyed, which says when enters the battlefield, create a 1/1 black and green insect creature token for each creature card in your graveyard. And on top of that, by paying black, green, and sacrificing another creature, we can gain 1 life and draw a card. So this can be a good sacrifice outlet as well that can help us draw cards too. Now, as good as all these cards have been, there is still one, in my opinion, that stands above the rest, and that is the Golden Pig of this deck, which, of course, is the #1 card out of our 99. And the Golden Pig for this deck is Empty the Catacombs. Empty the Catacombs is a sorcery for 3 and a black, and it says each player returns all creature cards from their graveyard to their hand. Now, this might benefit our opponents as well, but yeah, we're definitely going to be getting the most value out of this. This is essentially a 4-mana spell to get us back every single one of those free creatures, or again, the creatures that also, make us mana, like a Mirror Moon Vessel, back to our hand from our graveyard, so we can cast them again for free to sacrifice them again for even more value. This can lead to some incredibly explosive in-game ending turns very easily. I mean, just think about having, at least one free sacrifice outlet in play, or yeah, this can actually get us back against something like a Viserys here from our graveyard back to our hand so we can recast it. And then having, a couple of ways to draw cards whenever our creatures are sacrificed, we can easily draw into our entire deck just by setting ourselves up with something like this. So yeah, this card is absolutely incredible and definitely deserving of the title of Golden Pig of this deck. Moving on though, some other fantastic cards in this deck are cards like Reaping the Graves, Command the Dreadhorde, and Twilight's Call. Reaping the Graves is somewhat similar, but it is dependent on us having that big turn right then and there. Return target creature card from your graveyard to your hand, and it has Storm. So when you cast the spell, you basically get to copy it for each other's spell cast before it this turn. So if we are going off again, casting a ton of creatures, then sacrificing those creatures, we can essentially just get them all back with all those copies. Next up, how about Command the Dreadhorde, which can get all of our creatures back directly into play. At a slight cost, it says choose any number of target creature and or planeswalker cards in graveyards. Command the Dreadhorde deals damage to you equal to the total converted mana cost of those cards. Put them onto the battlefield under your control. Again, the vast majority of creatures in this deck have an extremely low converted mana cost to just 1, so yeah, we're going to be willing to pay a good amount of life to get those creatures back into play for even more value. Which, of course, if we've got something like a Moldervine Reclamation in play, we can just basically gain that life right back by sacrificing those creatures again. And finally, how about something like Twilight's Call, which actually you can cast at instant speed for just 2 more. It says each player returns all creature cards from their graveyard to the battlefield. So again, this one can be a little riskier because we are bringing our opponent's creatures back too, but yeah, we are able to get all of our creatures back and have a very explosive turn with something like this. Now, when it comes to explosive turns and other ways to finish off our opponents, though, we already talked about ways to, make a massive army, but of course we can do so with some other interesting effects like, Emrakul's Evangel. By tapping and sacrificing it and any number of other non-Eldrazi creatures, which, yeah, is the rest of our creatures, right? Put a 3/2 colorless Eldrazi horror creature token on the battlefield for each creature sacrificed this way. So this is a fantastic one-time sacrifice outlet, essentially, that can make us a massive army, again, replacing all of our creatures, all of our tiny little artifact creatures, with 3/2s. And speaking of replacing our creatures with, 3-power creatures, how about Rampage of the Clans? It's an instant that says destroy all artifacts and enchantments. For each permanent destroyed this way, its controller creates a 3/3 green centaur creature token. So yeah, right before our turn, we can essentially just cast this, mass board wipe every single artifact and enchantment in play, counting our opponents so they can get some 3/3s too, but still, they're probably not going to like that nearly as much as we do, because again, we're basically replacing all of our tiny artifact creatures with some massive 3/3s, or a massive number of 3/3s, you know what I mean. Anyways, Rise of the Dreadmarn is somewhat similar, but actually can be really impactful with a very explosive turn. It says create X/2/2 Black Zombie Berserker creature tokens, or X the number of non-token creatures that died this turn, and we can foretell it for just a single black mana. So this counts the total number of creatures dying in a turn, and again, there are going to be turns where we can sacrifice all of our creatures, get them back out in various ways, sacrifice them again, and yeah, we can sacrifice an absurd amount of creatures in a single turn. Keep in mind, this counts our opponent's creatures as well, so we have something like, Butcher of Malakir, that can be just a gross amount of 2/2s out of nowhere. So yeah, there are plenty of ways to finish our opponents off, and one of the most effective ones, though, might be a Zulaport Cutthroat, which, obviously with this deck and Umori in play, just costs a single black mana, which is fantastic. Whenever it or another creature you control dies, your opponent loses 1 life, and you gain 1 life. So this, of course, can drain our opponents out in absolutely no time. But now that we've talked about every single non-land card in this deck, let's talk about the lands. First up, there's Command Tower, which can tap for either our colors, Exotic Orchard, which can do so most of the time, and Ash Barrens, which we can basic land cycle away for a basic land. Next up, there's Evolving Wilds, Terramorphic Expanse, which we can both sacrifice, get a basic land to play tapped, and Riveteer's Overlook, which basically does the exact same thing. When it enters the battlefield, we sacrifice it, we can go get one of our basics into play tapped, and we gain 1 life. Then we've got some lands that can ramp us with Mirror Landscape and Blighted Woodland, and then Grim Backwoods, we can actually utilize sacrifice creatures to draw cards. And then Temple of Malady enters the battlefield tapped, has a Scry 1, can tap for either of our colors, and Golgari Rot Farm is our bounce land, which can tap for both of our colors. And of course, finally, we're going to be wrapping up this deck with some basic lands with forests and swamps. And now that we've talked about every single card in this deck, let's talk about the price. Like I mentioned at the beginning of this episode, every single card in this deck is less than $1, so it's a very budget-friendly deck at just $32.03. And keep in mind, that cost actually includes the cost of basic lands at 10 cents a piece, so if you already have those basics, there's some extra savings for you there. And speaking of potential extra savings, you might be able to save even more by buying this deck on TCG Player and utilizing heavily played and damaged cards, because of course, those cards need a home too. Though, also keep in mind that this estimated cost does not include the cost of shipping, which might vary depending upon where you live. And with that, the show is coming to a close, so it's my turn to hear from you. So in the comments below, let me know what your thoughts on this episode are, and as always, thanks again and have a good one. This show and episodes like this one are possible thanks to viewers like you. If you're looking for an easy way to help support this show, make sure that you like, share, and subscribe. Also, hit that bell notification icon so you don't miss any new episodes. You can also go check out our playmats and other merchandise at thecommandersquarters.com. We also have a ton of brand new t-shirt designs in stock, so make sure you check out those as well. Another easy way to support this show is with our TCG Player affiliate links. So whether you're buying a deck or individual cards, you can use this general link right here or one in the description. And the final way that you can support this show is by supporting us directly by becoming a patron. There are many benefits to being a patron, and I truly couldn't do this without all of their support.